Elevation came to Max this week, giving Anthony Mackie another chance at a leading role in a geek genre movie. Let's just rip off this Band-Aid so we can start the weekend, right? I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. The IMDb synopsis for Elevation reads, "A single father and two women venture from the safety of their homes to face monstrous creatures to save the life of a young boy." And that boy is Will's son, Will played by Anthony Mackie. This is a sort of a Quiet Place-like post-event world where, yes, there were these creatures that suddenly showed up, wiped out a ton of the population, are seemingly unstoppable, and so humanity is now surviving in these remote pockets, specifically that are highly elevated, because once the elevation gets to 8,000 feet, these creatures just will not go an inch beyond 8,000 feet in elevation. It's not just the Quiet Place comparisons. There's a lot of things in this movie that feel familiar. These characters, will maybe one or two will have an issue between them, or maybe some certain issue connecting them. And so just based on seeing these kinds of elements before, okay, so they're going to have this kind of moment, and then that's going to lead to this kind of moment, and then so-and-so will die, etc. It just feels very familiar. And when you understand the basic role and place in the story that each of these characters are playing in relationship to each other, in relationship to the plot, it just felt very easy to me to see what was going to happen, generally speaking, even if you don't know all the specifics. The dialogue also felt very familiar to me, with sort of cliche lines like "I can't do this alone," or other overly familiar questions and statements and stuff. It sounded very movie-like as people were talking. Characters also do not many times behave in ways that make sense emotionally, with emotions in general being played into far less than I think they should have been, given the dire situation, this horrible status quo that everyone is living in now. Certainly, they don't play into emotions like the Quiet Place movies did. Will, played by Mackie, in particular, lacks much emotion beyond being serious and determined. But, having lost his wife, trying to save his son, I wanted so much more emotion from him, so much more worry or stress or anger or haunted sadness. There comes a point later in the movie where he says to someone else, "I don't feel anything anymore." And I'm like, yeah, I believe it. And me either. I wasn't afraid for him or any of the characters. I didn't care about these situations because I didn't sense them caring. And so I wasn't able to really connect with why I should care at all. Now, one cool element of the story that I won't spoil is there's a reveal of the creature's nature and origin. And there are questions, big questions raised by this reveal that could lead to a conceptually expansive sequel. In fact, there's a post-credit scene that confirms this intention on the part of the writing. And maybe they thought that, with a relatively small budget, I believe it was only $18 million to make this movie, that they could make that money back and make a sequel that wasn't going to be overly ambitious in terms of its polish and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a method and a logic to that kind of movie making, but in looking, this appears to have only made $3.6 million in the box office, and I don't know how that's really going to be helped or more than doubled or anything like that by going to streaming services at this point. So it seems like it's totally going nowhere. So I highly doubt a sequel will happen. And that makes that very interesting concept that was revealed completely wasted, which is a real shame, because it was the one thing in the movie that I was like, oh, this is cool, this is interesting. All right, as far as the cast and the performances, the actress playing Nina felt wrong in her casting. She was a fine performer, but the casting itself felt wrong. Her type, and actors have different visual types, and if you just kind of take note of this, you'll start noticing, oh, he's got like a leading man face, she has a leading lady face, he has a character quirky actor type of face. There's just like different types that people get, roles that people get cast into based on the way they look, compared to, say, the stage, where it's much more about the actor's ability. So her type, her visual type, gave me false signals that, like, she was maybe a potential romantic interest, which the story doesn't call for at all. I would have preferred, and she would have felt more fitting, and honestly, the story would have felt a little bit more grounded and real and less movie-like if she had some more weight on her body, if her eyebrows were not plucked like a model's, and if she was 20 years older. I'm like, why not just cast a very different type for this kind of role? I think it would have made her function in the role she's intended for much more effectively for me. She did not read to me like someone who works in a lab in terms of Hollywood casting. She didn't read to me as the type that I'm supposed to, like, really dislike. And it's weird because nothing else about this movie subverts expectations, and so this just felt off. I can accept kind of like going against type casting, but I need to feel like there's some kind of reason for it, that they're subverting expectations, they're doing something creative, they're doing something original, and I just didn't feel like that was what was going on in this movie in general. Anthony Mackie. Now, I haven't seen him in much, in very little other than Falcon. Probably one other thing, but I can't remember what that thing was. And now I've seen him in 2 other things. But to shake only seeing Falcon in front of me when I'm looking at Anthony Mackie in a movie, I need more and different emotions and mannerisms from Mackie than I got here. Now, I have no idea what his ability is. Like I said, I have very little exposure to him. I've heard other people say that they really like him as an actor. I think that this could easily have been a directing or a script issue, but if he has more to him as a performer, this movie did not show it. Like, I needed to not just see Falcon in front of me the whole time. As far as stunts and visuals, one of the biggest shortcomings of the movie, I already mentioned what seems to be the lower budget of this movie. CG creatures, I think 100% CG creatures. CG explosions. Almost every time there was an explosion, it was either created entirely from CG or greatly enhanced by CG. And that took all the sense of reality away. I always, my philosophy is use CG to create things that can't exist in real life. So I can understand it being used for creatures to some degree, although I prefer kind of a marriage of both practical and CG techniques to represent creatures. But like when it comes to explosions, or humans, or, I mean, like, when you use CG, it just takes me out of the movie. I can just tell that, like, the actors, even though they're trying to look afraid, they're looking at a ping pong ball. You know, I can tell that tentacle thing, that is not there in front of them. And the explosions lose all sense of drama and impact that they're supposed to have. The climax of this movie, it was very dependent on explosions. And I'm like, oh no, this is terrible. This is terrible. I'm not feeling this at all. It's an action horror movie, and the action felt unavoidably pretend to me. So very disappointing. As far as themes go, anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance going on in the themes here that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation. There's 3 writers involved, and I don't really know where they're coming at in terms of their philosophical perspective. I wonder if one of them was maybe interested in saying something about God or religion or spiritual beliefs, but maybe the other cooks in the kitchen or the editing or whatever, something in the process just didn't allow that to go anywhere, because there was these unique or curious instances of God talk that didn't develop or go anywhere. One person says that, maybe the Jesus freaks were right, that the reapers, those are the creatures, were God's judgment for our sins, for eating God's apple and clear-cutting the Garden of Eden with the knowledge it gave us. Okay, so that's interesting just in and of itself, mentioning God, referencing the Garden of Eden and stuff like that. Okay, what's that about? That's not a very typical thing in movies today. But whoever these Jesus freaks are, I think they need to read their Bibles, I guess, because there's no apple in the Garden of Eden. There's fruit, but this idea of an apple, that's not in the Bible. Humanity didn't destroy or cut down the Garden of Eden with the knowledge given by the fruit. That's not remotely what happened. Another moment between 2 characters. a character said, physicists, speaking of their own profession, make a living unlocking God's secrets. Now, I think that's kind of an interesting little beat there, because much of science in its early development came from Christians who very much had that attitude of, we want to understand God's creation. It wasn't to, there's this weird, unnecessary, illogical antagonism in some people's minds today, as though belief in God and pursuit of the sciences are somehow at odds. And so that was an interesting note. I was like, okay, cool. That's interesting coming from the mouth of a scientist character. Another character said to someone, "You swear a lot." And their response was "F you," And I was like, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess they were dropping F-bombs a lot, but not that much more than just some other movie that would be rated R for language. Why make that point? Why make that statement? The one who said that I didn't think of as particularly conservative or religious or a prude or anything like that. They just kind of made this statement, and I was like, interesting. And I waited for that to kind of develop and go somewhere. Later on, one character asks another character after they just went through a terrible situation, and one of the surviving characters did the, what do you call it, the Catholic genuflect, I think is what it's called. He said, "You still believe in God?" And she says, "I'm stubborn." He says, "What did you ask for?" She says, "Revenge." So interesting, just kind of touching on some of these ideas about God. And I think it's sensible in dire circumstances that people would find themselves questioning their belief in God. We see that in the Psalms repeatedly, is more of a question of, where are you, God? Why aren't you doing something, rather than actual belief in his existence being the question. But it does highlight, I think, one truth that tends to be the case, is that belief in God is most often not about evidence and reason. That if people do not believe in God and do not want to pursue belief in God, do not want to consider the evidence or just scoff at all the evidence and stuff, there is almost always some kind of an emotional thing going on there, a way that they've been hurt, perhaps by Christians, or a way in which their life did not go the way they wanted it to, and horrible things happened, and they are pointing a finger at God because of that. There's almost always some kind of an emotional thing going on, or there's a distaste for something about God or what God has said in Scripture that is at play. And the fact that, like, her attitude is asking for revenge, that plays into another kind of idea that's very common. People tend to, includes Christians, tend to make their prayer lives about rubbing a lamp and hoping that God the genie will grant their wishes and stuff. So, but even so, even though these little things were in there, none of it felt like it went anywhere. So I'm very curious as to, like, what happened in the writing and the editing process. Anyway, no idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, skip. Completely uninteresting, despite one wasted concept that was worth exploring more and now will never be explored. This one is rated R for language, which I guess means the MPAA thought the violence had no impact either. And those, I think, are all of my thoughts for now on Elevation. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining at patreon.com/Spirit Blade Productions. Then I hope you'll check out our podcast and stay connected to all CGC content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.